All right, differentiating instruction. Let's get right into it and start with the big question why? We were highly impacted when we first saw a demonstration of this cartoon. We call it the shovel. If you notice, we have a very well meaning, long tenured groundskeeper at the school, a guy that the kids know and love, a guy that the parents and staff know and love. Very well meaning guy. And I say that on purpose, okay, because a lot of times our biases are not frontal lobe decisions and frontal lobe thoughts. They are somewhere deep in the back of our mind as to what normal is and should look like. Now, if there's any group of teachers ever that understand that the norms of life can change on a dime, it's you guys. We are going through a process right now where, not by our own choice, all of our normals have been changed. So let's look at this cartoon from that vantage point and see what these speak bubbles talk about. The first one is that this guy in the wheelchair, okay, he has something to say to groundskeeper Joe, and it's, hey, could you please shovel the ramp? And well-meaning, well-loved groundskeeper Joe says, of course, but all these kids are waiting to use the stairs. First, let me shovel them off, and I'll clear the ramp for you. So the reply back is a startling one. If you shovel the ramp, we can all get in. Sometimes we leave out the one for the sake of the many, when we should be thinking about that backwards and understand that clearing a path for the one will clear a path for all. Now, I used to jokingly say, and now I really believe it, that I was an undiagnosed student of need. And when I look back on my school career, I realized that that's the very truth. In fact, I started to teach because no one was able to reach and teach me. And then I stepped in and started to teach math because that was the mystery of my young life, was how in the world could I understand everything in the moment and retain and be able to do nothing when I had to use it. And so I was on a quest, and that led me to this journey of equity and access, and really the 5 E's, a way to personalize and create my own way of doing something that I can then make practical use of. So what is differentiation? It's tailored instruction. It's not individualized instruction. Okay, what we can't do is get it twisted in this, especially in a blended learning environment where we feel like giving students a learning platform that walks them through an individualized step-by-step version, even based on diagnostic. I'm not saying that those things are bad. I'm saying that that is not necessarily differentiated instruction. Differentiated instruction is tailoring instruction so that we meet individuals' needs. Okay, but that process allows them to take more ownership over it and understand and kind of meet the demands of your intentional planning choices that led them to this. So here are the 3 areas that you can differentiate. I want to say now, for the sake of accuracy, that learning environment is another differentiated environment. And I didn't put that as an extra bubble because that's exactly what we're doing right now. We are looking at highly effective teaching in a blended learning environment, and the idea of blended learning, and where we have in-person and or online instruction, whether that's live or asynchronous, that is by nature already differentiating the learning environment. So let's look at the content then. Some of this, I hope, is starting to be very familiar to you. These are not my words. These are the words of the researchers and the experts in the field of differentiation that say content differentiation means that we are helping students make meaning. I hope that that became familiar to you. It's the first part of our rigorous and engaging instruction definition. What students need to know or how they will access this information. If the word access is bringing the idea of entry activities into your mind, of visual vocabulary, non-linguistic representation, of multiple entry points, Okay, then you're on the right track. You're thinking right. That was a sideways kind of formative assessment and for you to self-reflect on. The idea of differentiating content, making meaning, internalizing that meaning, those things all go together. That's why it's a rigorous and engaging environment. Okay, when we get to process, that's the second part of our definition of rigor. It's to develop a personal process, to engage students in activities that will deepen their understanding, but those activities need to focus on their process. Many and most of the time, our idea of exploration should be collaborative in nature. Okay, collaborative in nature in an online environment might be talking about ways in which students can see others' work, can add to a text like stream on Padlet, can add to a conversation on a Google Doc. Okay, it doesn't always have to be face to face. We talked about the strategy taxonomy and how we can use that to differentiate, no pun intended, why, our purpose behind our strategies, and then bring those strategies down to a student directed experience, because it is only when we personalize this do we really start to understand it. Okay, the last piece of the differentiation puzzle is the product. So when we talk about rigorous instruction, we say we are having students internalize meaning, create their own personal process, and apply that understanding to new and varied situations. Now, those varied situations might mean many multimodal options, like different contexts, different ways of putting it into real world application, different performance tasks, or any other assignment or assessment that is aligned with standardized testing. This is how it'll be used in real life. This is how we were working and developing it in class. This is how it's going to be assessed when you have to show what you know on a standardized assessment. Those three areas are the general areas of use of learning. Think about driving a car. Think about the ways that you learned how to drive a car. It wasn't because you wrote a written test and got your permit. It wasn't because you watched someone drive. And it wasn't even because you practiced driving. But it was because then you were put under real world conditions in an assessment where somebody was able to judge based on certain criteria. It is the same process in terms of the learning and in terms of showing evidence of that learning. So how do we connect these dots? Okay, we can connect all of this and move from a whole group differentiation to small and individualized differentiation. And that's where some accommodations or different learning modifications come in. We are going to touch on these, but we are not going to dive too deep because that would require an understanding of our class roster. You will be faced with 25, 30, 18, 32. I don't know how many students in your class, but a good handful of them will not be able to access content correctly by just working through your whole or small group differentiation process. You're going to have to consider very specific learning needs. Those are usually scripted out in different forms and fashions, and you will get access to their needs and their program that has been successful for students in the past. But there are some ways to generalize accommodations and modifications and really go back to the idea of how, like, where we started with the why. Because if we can accommodate the one, then oftentimes we can accommodate the many. Now, this works the same with lesson modifications. So you notice the big blank orange underneath, because lesson accommodations and lesson modifications might need this blank canvas to start with as a representation of how students in your class will change from year to year. But here's the catch, guys. It changes from class period to class period. And you may need to add and consider some adaptations and modifications to your lessons for in-person learning based on the time of day that you are working with certain students. Is it after lunch? Is it before lunch? Is it after PE or another active class time where they're sweating, or they're engaged in something so strenuous, or a competition, that it's hard for the students to decompress and get back into a learning mode? So you're going to have to understand your students from that vantage point, and you'll see how that works as you experience this. And I'm encouraging you to take special note of the way other teachers in the building might handle those situations. And we are never too far along in our career not to start and go back and recognize, let me remember what time of day I'm dealing with certain kids, and how I can best modify to bring access and equity to the whole process. So now let's talk about this blended situation. Can we apply this to an online environment? Well, if we couldn't, we wouldn't be here. And so the critical content question, how can we do this in an online learning environment, is going to be answered in the next couple of smaller, shorter clips, talking about ways in which you can process through the 5 E's and using online tools, all the different ways to access content on your entry, the ways to explore content collaboratively, the ways in which students can have a rich examples for learning tasks that they can use some self-evaluation on, and then how they can elaborate on their understanding, and even different modifications and such, like online timers and things like that. And then we're going to get into looking at a sample lesson. It's a Google Doc, and I'm going to just kind of point out some important tips along the way as to how to make those modifications and adaptations consistent and constant in your teaching, in your online teaching, and of course in your in-person teaching as well. The same processes can apply. And when we connect all these dots, we're going to then show you on Mosaic how you can print different options that will help access information from student note-taking guides that can be translated into different languages, or translanguaged into different languages, to the structure of the note-taking guide themselves, the Cornell style, to different ways in which you can impart color and different modifications that cause things to stand out, increase font, et cetera, et cetera. So we'll wrap that up with the Mosaic example when you are creating your own work in there. Okay, so your work product, which we already mentioned in the statement of instructional purpose, is going to be a differentiated, processed way of creating learning supports in an online environment, so that we can create equity and access for all our students.